Dead Men Tell No Tales by Ernest William Hornung. Chapter 6. The Sole Survivor. A few weeks later I landed in England, I, who no longer desired to set foot on any land again. At 29 I was gaunt and gray. My nerves were shattered, my heart was broken, and my face showed it without let or hindrance from the spirit that was broken too. Pride, will, courage, and endurance. All these had expired in my long and lonely battle with the sea. They had kept me alive for this, and now they left me naked to mine enemies. For every hand seemed raised against me, though in reality it was the hand of fellowship that the world stretched out, and the other was the reading of a jaundiced eye. I could not help it. There was a poison in my veins that made me all ingratitude and perversity. The world welcomed me back, and I returned the compliment by sulking like the recaptured runaway I was at heart. The world showed a sudden interest in me, so I took no further interest in the world, but, on the contrary, resented its attentions with unreasonable warmth and obduracy, and my would-be friends I regarded as my very worst enemies. The majority, I feel sure, meant but well and kindly by the poor survivor. But the survivor could not forget that his name was still in the newspapers, nor blink the fact that he was an unworthy hero of the passing hour. And he suffered enough from brazenly meddlesome and self-seeking folk, from impudent and inquisitive intruders, to justify some suspicion of old acquaintances suddenly styling themselves old friends, and of distant connections newly and unduly eager to claim relationship. Many I misjudged, and have long known it. On the whole, however, I wonder at that attitude of mine as little as I approve of it. If I had distinguished myself in any other way, it would have been a different thing. It was the fussy, sentimental, inconsiderate interest in one thrown into purely accidental and necessarily painful prominence, the vulgarization of an unspeakable tragedy that my soul abhorred. I confess that I regarded it from my own unique and selfish point of view. What was a thrilling matter to the world was a torturing memory to me. The quintessence of the torture was, moreover, my own secret. It was not the loss of the Lady Jermyn that I could not bear to speak about. It was my own loss, but the one involved the other. My loss apart, however, it was plain enough to dwell upon experiences so terrible and yet so recent as those which I had lived to tell. I did what I considered my duty to the public, but I certainly did no more. My reticence was rebuked in the papers that made the most of me, but would fain have made more. And yet I do not think that I was anything but docile with those who had a manifest right to question me, to the owners and to other interested persons, with whom I was confronted on one pretext or another. I told my tale as fully and as freely as I have told it here, though each telling hurt more than the last. That was necessary and unavoidable. It was the private intrusions which I resented with all the spleen the sea had left me in exchange for the qualities it had taken away. Relatives I had as few as misanthropists could desire, but from self-congratulation on the fact, on first landing, I soon came to keen regret. They at least would have sheltered me from spies and busybodies. They at least would have secured the peace and privacy of one who was no hero in fact or spirit, whose noblest deed was a piece of self-preservation, which he wished undone with all his heart. Self-consciousness no doubt multiplied my flattering assailants. I have said that my nerves were shattered. I may have imagined much and exaggerated the rest. Yet what truth there was in my suspicions you shall duly see. I felt sure that I was followed in the street, and my every movement dogged by those to whom I would not condescend to turn and look. Meanwhile, I had not the courage to go near my club, and the Temple was a place where I was accosted in every court, effusively congratulated on the marvelous preservation of my stale, spoilt life, and invited right and left to spin my yarn over a quiet pipe. Well, perhaps such invitations were not so common as they have grown in my memory. Nor must you confuse my then feelings on all these matters with those which I entertain as I write. I have grown older, and, I hope, something kindlier and wiser since then. Yet to this day, I cannot blame myself for abandoning my chambers and avoiding my club. For a temporary asylum, I pitched upon a small, quiet, empty, private hotel which I knew of in Charterhouse Square. Instantly the room next mine became occupied. All the first night, I imagined I heard voices talking about me in that room next door. It was becoming a disease with me. Either I was being dogged, watched, followed day and night, indoors and out, or I was the victim of a very ominous hallucination. That night, I never closed an eye nor lowered my light. In the morning, I took a four-wheel cab and drove straight to Harley Street. And upon my soul, as I stood on the specialist's doorstep, I could have sworn I saw the occupant of the room next mine dash by me in a hansom. "Ah," said the specialist, "so you cannot sleep. You hear voices. You fancy you are being followed in the street. You don't think these fancies spring entirely from the imagination? Not entirely, just so. And you keep looking behind you, as though somebody were at your elbow, and you prefer to sit with your back close to the wall. Just so, just so. Distressing symptoms, to be sure, but hardly to be wondered at in a man who has come through your nervous strain." A keen professional light glittered in his eyes. "And almost commonplace," he added, smiling, "compared with the hallucinations you must have suffered from on that hen coop. Ah, my dear sir, the psychological interest of your case is very great." "It may be," said I, brusquely, "but I come to you to get that hen coop out of my head, not to be reminded of it. Everybody asks me about the damned thing, and you follow everybody else. I wish it, and I were at the bottom of the sea together." This speech had the effect of really interesting the doctor in my present condition, which was indeed one of chronic irritation and extreme excitability, alternating with fits of the very blackest despair. Instead of offending my gentleman, I had put him on his mettle, and for half an hour he honored me with the most exhaustive inquisition ever elicited from a medical man. His panacea was somewhat in the nature of an anticlimax, but at least it had the merits of simplicity and of common sense. A change of air, perfect quiet, say a cottage in the country, not too near the sea. And he shook my hand kindly when I left. "Keep up your heart, my dear sir," said he. "Keep up your courage and your heart." "My heart!" I cried. "It's at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean." He was the first to whom I had said as much. He was a stranger. What did it matter? And, oh, it was so true, so true. Every day and all day I was thinking of my love. Every hour and all hours she was before me with her sunny hair and young face. Her wistful eyes were gazing into mine continually. Their wistfulness I had never realized at the time, but now I did, and I saw it for what it seemed always to have been, the soft, sad, yearning look of one fated to die young. So young, and I might live to be an old man, mourning her. That I should never love again, I knew full well. This time there was no mistake. I have implied, I believe, that it was for another woman I fled originally to the diggings. Well, that one was still unmarried. And when the papers were full of me, she wrote me a letter which I now believe to have been merely kind. At the time, I was all uncharitableness. But words of mine would fail to tell you how cold this letter left me. It was as a candle lighted in the full blaze of the sun. With all my bitterness, however, you must not suppose that I had quite lost the feelings which had inspired me at sunset on the lonely ocean, while my mind still held good. I had been too near my Maker ever to lose those feelings altogether. They were with me in the better moments of these my worst days. I trusted his wisdom still. There was a reason for everything. There were reasons for all this. I alone had been saved out of all those souls who sailed from Melbourne in the Lady German. Why should I have been the favored one? I with my broken heart, and now lonely life. Some great inscrutable reason there must be. At my worst I did not deny that. But neither did I puzzle my sick brain with the reason. I just waited for it to be revealed to me, if it were God's will ever to reveal it, and that I conceived to be the one spirit in which a man may contemplate, with equal sanity and reverence, the mysteries and the miseries of his life. Chapter 7. I find a friend. The night after I consulted the specialist, I was quite determined to sleep. I had laid in a bundle of the daily papers. No country cottage was advertised to let, but I knew of it by evening, and about all the likely ones I had already written. The scheme occupied my thoughts. Trout fishing was a desideratum. I would take my rod and plenty of books, would live simply and frugally, and it should make a new man of me by Christmas. It was now October. I went to sleep thinking of autumn tints against an autumn sunset. It must have been very early, certainly not later than 10 o'clock. The previous night, I had not slept at all. Now, this private hotel of mine was a very old-fashioned house, dark and dingy all day long, with heavy old chandeliers and black old oak, and dead flowers and broken flower pots surrounding a grimy grass plot in the rear. On this latter my bedroom window looked, and never am I likely to forget the vile music of the cats throughout my first long wakeful night there. The second night, they actually woke me. Doubtless they had been busy long enough, but it was all of a sudden that I heard them, and lay listening for more, wide awake in an instant. My window had been very softly opened, and the draught fanned my forehead as I held my breath. A faint light glimmered through a ground-glass pane over the door, and was dimly reflected by the toilet mirror, in its usual place against the window. This mirror I saw moved, and next moment I had bounded from bed. The mirror fell with a horrid clatter. The toilet table followed it with a worse. The thief had gone as he had come ere my toes halted aching amid the debris. A useless little balcony, stone slab and iron railing, jutted out from my window. I thought I saw a hand on the railing, another on the slab, then both together on the lower level for one instant before they disappeared. There was a dull yet springy thud on the grass below. Then no more noise but the distant thunder of the traffic, and the one that woke me, until the window next mine was thrown up. What the devil's up? The voice was rich, cheery, light-hearted, agreeable. All that my own was not, as I answered, nothing, for this was not the first time my next-door neighbor had tried to scrape acquaintance with me. But surely, sir, I heard the very dickens of a row? You may have done. I was afraid someone had broken into your room. As a matter of fact, said I, put to shame by the undiminished good humor of my neighbor, someone did. But he's gone now, so let him be. Gone? Not he. He's getting over that wall. After him, and the head disappeared from the window next mine. I rushed into the corridor, and was just in time to intercept a singularly handsome young fellow, at whom I had hardly taken the trouble to look until now. He was in full evening dress, and his face was radiant with the spirit of mischief and adventure. For God's sake, sir, I whispered, let this matter rest. I shall have to come forward if you persist, and heaven knows I have been before the public quite enough. His dark eyes questioned me an instant, then fell as though he would not disguise that he recollected and understood. I liked him for his good taste. I liked him for his tacit sympathy, and better still for the amusing disappointment in his gallant, young face. I am sorry to have robbed you of a pleasant chase, said I. At one time, I should have been the first to join you. But, to tell you the truth, I've had enough excitement lately to last me for my life. I can believe that, he answered, with his fine eyes full upon me. How strangely I had misjudged him. I saw no vulgar curiosity in his flattering gaze, but rather that very sympathy of which I stood in need. I offered him my hand. It is very good of you to give in, I said. No one else has heard a thing, you see. I shall look for another opportunity of thanking you tomorrow. No, cried he. Thanks be hanged, but I say, if I promise you not to bore you about things, won't you drink a glass of brandy and water in my room before you turn in again? Brandy and water being the very thing I needed, and this young man pleasing me more and more, I said that I would join him with all my heart, and return to my room for my dressing gown and slippers. To find them, however, I had to light my candles, when the first thing I saw was the havoc my marauder had left behind him. The mirror was cracked across. The dressing table had lost a leg, and both lay flat, with my brushes and shaving table, and the foolish toilet crockery which no one uses, but I should have to replace, strewn upon the carpet. But one thing I found that had not been there before. Under the window lay a formidable sheath knife without its sheath. I picked it up with something of a thrill, which did not lessen when I felt its edge. The thing was diabolically sharp. I took it with me to show my neighbor, whom I found giving his order to the boots. It seemed that it was barely midnight, and that he had only just come in when the clatter took place in my room. "Hello," he cried when the man was gone, and I produced my trophy. "Why, what the mischief have you got there?" "My caller's card," said I. He left it behind him. "Feel the edge." I have seldom seen a more indignant face than the one which my new acquaintance bent over the weapon, as he held it to the light and ran his finger along the blade. He could have not frowned more heavily if he had recognized the knife. "The villains," he muttered. "The damned villains." "Villains?" I queried. "Did you see more than one of them, then?" "Didn't you?" he asked quickly. Yes, to be sure. There was at least one other beggar, skulking down below. He stood looking at me, the knife in his hand, though mine was held out for it. "Don't you think, Mr. Cole, that it's our duty to hand this over to the police?" I've heard of other cases about these Inns of Court. There's evidently a gang of them, and this knife might convict the lot. There's no saying. Anyway, I think the police should have it. If you like, I'll take it to Scotland Yard myself and hand it over without mentioning your name." "Oh, if you keep my name out of it," said I, "and say nothing about it here in the hotel, you may do what you like, and welcome. It's the proper course, no doubt. Only I've had publicity enough, and would sooner have felt that blade in my body than set my name going again in the newspapers." "I understand," he said, with his well-bred sympathy, which never went a shade too far, and he dropped the weapon into a drawer as the boots entered with the tray. In a minute he had brewed 2 steaming jorums of spirits and water. As he handed me one, I feared he was going to drink my health or toast my luck, but no, he was the one man I had met who seemed, as he said, to understand. Nevertheless, he had his toast. "Here's confusion to the criminal classes in general," he cried, "but death and damnation to the owners of that knife." And we clinked tumblers across the little oval table in the middle of the room. It was more of a sitting room than mine. A bright fire was burning in the grate, and my companion insisted on my sitting over it in the armchair, while for himself he fetched the one from his bedside and drew up the table so that our glasses should be handy. He then produced a handsome cigar case admirably stocked, and we smoked and sipped in the coziest fashion, though without exchanging many words. You may imagine my pleasure in the society of a youth, equally charming in looks, manners, and address, who had not one word to say to me about the Lady German or my hen coop. It was unique, yet such, I suppose, was my native contrariety, that I felt I could have spoken of the catastrophe to this very boy with less reluctance than to any other creature whom I had encountered since my deliverance. He seemed so full of silent sympathy. His consideration for my feelings was so marked, and yet so unobtrusive. I have called him a boy. I am apt to write as the old man I have grown, though I do believe I felt older then than now. In any case, my young friend was some years my junior. I afterwards found out that he was 26. I have also called him handsome. He was the handsomest man that I have ever met, had the frankest face, the finest eyes, the brightest smile. Yet his bronze forehead was low, and his mouth rather impudent and bold than truly strong. And there was a touch of foppery about him, in the enormous white tie and the much-cherished whiskers of the 50s, which was only redeemed by that other touch of devilry that he had shown me in the corridor. By the rich brown of his complexion, as well as by a certain sort of swagger in his walk, I should have said that he was a naval officer ashore, had he not told me who he was of his own accord. "By the way," he said, "I ought to give you my name. It's Rattray, of one of the many Kirby halls in this country. My one's down in Lancashire." "I suppose there's no need to tell my name," said I, less sadly, I dare say, than I had ever yet alluded to the tragedy which I alone survived. It was an unnecessary allusion, too, as a reference to the foregoing conversation will show. "Well, no," said he in his frank fashion. "I can't honestly say there is." We took a few puffs, he watching the fire, and I his firelit face. "It must seem strange to you to be sitting with the only man who lived to tell the tale." The egotism of this speech was not wholly gratuitous. I thought it did seem strange to him, that a needless constraint was put upon him by excessive consideration for my feelings. I desired to set him at his ease as he had set me at mine. On the contrary, he seemed quite startled by my remark. "It is strange," he said, with a shudder, followed by the biggest sip of brandy and water he had taken yet. "It must have been horrible, horrible," he added to himself, his dark eyes staring into the fire. "Ah," said I, "it was even more horrible than you suppose or can ever imagine. I was not thinking of myself, nor of my love, nor of any particular incident of the fire that still went on burning in my brain. My tone was doubtless confidential, But I was meditating no special confidence when my companion drew one with his next words. These, however, came after a pause, in which my eyes had fallen from his face, but in which I heard him emptying his glass. "What do you mean?" he whispered. "That there were other circumstances, things which haven't got into the papers?" "God knows there were," I answered, my face in my hands. And my grief brought home to me. There I sat with it in the presence of that stranger, without compunction and without shame. He sprang up and paced the room. His tact made me realize my weakness, and I was struggling to overcome it when he surprised me by suddenly stopping and laying a rather tremulous hand upon my shoulder. It wouldn't do you any good to speak of those circumstances, I suppose," he faltered. "No, not now, no good at all. Forgive me," he said, resuming his walk. "I had no business. I felt so sorry. I cannot tell you how I sympathize. And yet, I wonder if you will always feel so. No saying how I shall feel when I am a man again," said I. "You see what I am at present." And, pulling myself together, I rose to find my new friend quite agitated in his turn. "I wish we had some more brandy," he sighed. "I'm afraid it's too late to get any now." "And I'm glad of it," said I. "A man in my state ought not to look at spirits, or he may never look past them again. Thank goodness there are other medicines. Only this morning I consulted the best man on nerves in London. I wish I'd gone to him long ago. Harley Street, was it? Yes. Saw you on his doorstep. By Jove," cried Rattray at once. "I was driving over to Hampstead, and I thought it was you. Well, what's the prescription?" In my satisfaction at finding that he had not been dogging me intentionally, though I had forgotten the incident till he reminded me of it, I answered his question with unusual fullness. "I should go abroad," said Rattray. "But then I always am abroad. It's only the other day I got back from South America, and I shall up anchor again before this filthy English winter sets in." Was he a sailor after all, or only a well-to-do wanderer on the face of the earth? He now mentioned that he was only in England for a few weeks, to have a look at his estate, and so forth. After which he plunged into more or less enthusiastic advocacy of this or that foreign resort, as opposed to the English cottage upon which I told him I had set my heart. He was now, however, less spontaneous, I thought, than earlier in the night. His voice had lost its hearty ring, and he seemed preoccupied, as if talking of one matter while he thought upon another. Yet he would not let me go, and presently he confirmed my suspicion, no less than my first impression of his delightful frankness and cordiality, by candidly telling me what was on his mind. "If you really want a cottage in the country," said he, "and the most absolute peace and quiet to be got in this world, I know of the very thing on my land in Lancashire. It would drive me mad in a week. But if you really care for that sort of thing, an occupied cottage?" I interrupted. "Yes, a couple rent it from me, very decent people of the name of Braithwaite. The man is out all day, and won't bother you when he's in. He's not like other people, poor chap. But the woman's all there, and would do her best for you in a humble, simple, wholesome sort of way. You think they would take me in? They have taken other men, artists as a rule. Then it's a picturesque country? Oh, it's that if it's nothing else, but not a town for miles, mind you, and hardly a village worthy the name. Any fishing? Yes, trout, small but plenty of 'em, in a beck running close behind the cottage." "Come," cried I, "this sounds delightful. Shall you be up there?" "Only for a day or two," was the reply. "I shan't trouble you, Mr. Cole." "My dear sir, that wasn't my meaning at all. I'm only sorry I shall not see something of you on your own heath. I can't thank you enough for your kind suggestion. When do you suppose the Braithwaites could do with me?" His charming smile rebuked my impatience. "We must first see whether they can do with you at all," said he. "I sincerely hope they can, but this is their time of year for tourists, though perhaps a little late. I'll tell you what I'll do. As a matter of fact, I'm going down there tomorrow, and I got to telegraph to my place in any case to tell them when to meet me. I'll send the telegram first thing, and I'll make them send one back to say whether there's room in the cottage or not." I thanked him warmly, but asked if the cottage was close to Kirby Hall, and whether this would not be giving a deal of trouble at the other end. Whereupon he mischievously misunderstood me a second time, saying the cottage and the hall were not even in sight of each other, and I really had no intrusion to fear, as he was a lonely bachelor like myself, and would only be up there 4 or 5 days at the most. So I made my appreciation of his society plainer than ever to him. For indeed I had found a more refreshing pleasure in it already than I had hoped to derive from mortal man again, and we parted at 3 o'clock in the morning like old fast friends. "Only don't expect too much, my dear Mr. Cole," were his last words to me. "My own place is as ancient and as tumble down as most ruins that you pay to see over. And I'm never there myself because, I tell you frankly, I hate it like poison." Chapter 8. A Small Precaution. My delight in the society of this young Squire Rattray, as I soon was to hear him styled, had been such as to make me almost forget the sinister incident which had brought us together. When I returned to my room, however, there were the open window and the litter on the floor to remind me of what had happened earlier in the night. Yet I was less disconcerted than you might suppose. A common housebreaker can have few terrors for one who has braved those of mid-ocean single-handed. My would-be visitor had no longer any for me, for it had not yet occurred to me to connect him with the voices and the footsteps to which, indeed, I had been unable to swear before the doctor. On the other hand, these morbid imaginings, as I was far from unwilling to consider them, had one and all deserted me in the sane, clean company of the capital young fellow in the next room. I have confessed my condition up to the time of this queer meeting. I have tried to bring young Rattray before you with some hint of his freshness and his boyish charm, and though the sense of failure is heavy upon me there, I who knew the man knew also that I must fail to do him justice. Enough may have been said, however, to impart some faint idea of what this youth was to me in the bitter and embittering anticlimax of my life. Conventional figures spring to my pen, but every one of them is true. He was flowers in spring, he was sunshine after rain, he was rain following long months of drought. I slept admirably after all, and I awoke to see the overturned toilet table, and to thrill as I remembered there was one fellow creature with whom I could fraternize without fear of a rude reopening of my every wound. I hurried my dressing in the hope of our breakfasting together. I knocked at the next door, and, receiving no answer, even ventured to enter, with the same idea. He was not there. He was not in the coffee room. He was not in the hotel. I broke my fast in disappointed solitude, and I hung about disconsolate all the morning, looking wistfully for my new-made friend. Towards midday, he drove up in a cab, which he kept waiting at the curb. "It's all right," he cried out in his hearty way. "I sent my telegram first thing, and I've had the answer in my club. The rooms are vacant, and I'll see that Jane Braithwaite is all ready for you by tomorrow night." I thanked him from my heart. "You seem in a hurry," I added as I followed him up the stairs. "I am," said he. "It's a near thing for the train. I've just time to stick in my things. Then I'll stick in mine," said I impulsively, "and I'll come with you, and doss down in any corner for the night." He stopped and turned on the stairs. "You mustn't do that," said he. "They won't have anything ready. I'm going to make it my privilege to see that everything is as cozy as possible when you arrive. I simply can't allow you to come today, Mr. Cole." He smiled, but I saw that he was in earnest, and of course I gave in. "All right," said I. "Then I must content myself with seeing you off at the station." To my surprise, his smile faded, and a flush of undisguised annoyance made him, if anything, better looking than ever. It brought out a certain strength of mouth and jaw which I had not observed there hitherto. It gave him an ugliness of expression which only emphasized his perfection of feature. "You mustn't do that either," said he shortly. "I have an appointment at the station. I shall be talking business all the time." He was gone to his room, and I went to mine feeling duly snubbed. Yet I deserved it, for I had exhibited a characteristic, though not chronic, want of taste, of which I am sometimes guilty to this day. Not to show ill feeling on the head of it, I nevertheless followed him down again in 4 or 5 minutes, and I was rewarded by his brightest smile as he grasped my hand. "Come tomorrow by the same train," said he, naming station, line, and hour. "Unless I telegraph, all will be ready and you shall be met. You may rely on reasonable charges. As to the fishing, go upstream, to the right when you strike the beck, and you'll find a good pool or two. I may have to go to Lancaster the day after tomorrow, but I shall give you a call when I get back." With that we parted, as good friends as ever. I observed that my regret at losing him was shared by the Boots, who stood beside me on the steps as his hansom rattled off. "I suppose Mr. Rattray stays here always when he comes to town," said I. "No, sir," said the man. "We've never had him before. Not in my time, but I shouldn't mind if he came again." And he looked twice at the coin in his hand before pocketing it with evident satisfaction. Lonely as I was, and wished to be, I think that I never felt my loneliness as I did during the 24 hours which intervened between Rattray's departure and my own. They dragged like wet days by the sea, and the effect was as depressing. I have seldom been at such a loss for something to do, and in my idleness I behaved like a child, wishing my new friend back again, or myself on the railway with my new friend, until I blushed for the beanstalk growth of my regard for him, an utter stranger and a younger man. I am less ashamed of it now. He had come into my dark life like a lamp, and his going left a darkness deeper than before. In my dejection, I took a new view of the night's outrage. It was no common burglar's work, for what had I worth stealing? It was the work of my unseen enemies who dogged me in the street. They alone knew why. The doctor had called these hallucinations, and I had forced myself to agree with the doctor, but I could not deceive myself in my present mood. I remembered the steps, the stopping when I stopped, the drawing away in the crowded streets, the closing up in quieter places. Why had I never looked round? Why? Because till today I had thought it mere vulgar curiosity. Because a few had bored me, I had imagined the many at my heels. But now I knew. It was the few again, a few who hated me even unto death. The idea took such a hold upon me that I did not trouble my head with reasons and motives. Certain persons had designs upon my life. That was enough for me. On the whole, the thought was stimulating. It set a new value on existence, and it roused a certain amount of spirit even in me. I would give the fellows another chance before I left town. They should follow me once more, and this time to some purpose. Last night they had left a knife on me. Tonight I would have a keepsake ready for them. Hitherto I had gone unarmed since my landing, which perhaps was no more than my duty as a civilized citizen. On Black Hill Flats, however, I had formed another habit, of which I should never have broken myself so easily, but for the fact that all the firearms I ever had were reddening and rotting at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. I now went out and bought me such a one as I had never possessed before. The revolver was then in its infancy, but it did exist, and by dusk I was owner of as fine a specimen as could be procured in the city of London. It had but 5 chambers, but the barrel was 10 inches long. One had to cap it, and to put in the powder and the wadded bullets separately, but the last named would have killed an elephant. The oak case that I bought with it cumbers my desk as I write, and, shut, you would think that it had never contained anything more lethal than fruit knives. I open it, and there are the green baize compartments, one with a box of percussion caps, still apparently full, another that could not contain many more wadded bullets, and a third with a powder horn which can never have been much lighter. Within the lid is a label bearing the makers' names. The gentlemen themselves are unknown to me, even if they are still alive. Nevertheless, after 45 years, let me dip my pen to Messrs. Dean, Adams and Dean. That night I left this case in my room, locked, and the key in my waistcoat pocket. In the right-hand side pocket of my overcoat, I carried my Dean and Adams, loaded in every chamber, also my right hand, as innocently as you could wish. And just that night, I was not followed. I walked across Regent's Park, and I dawdled on Primrose Hill, without the least result. Down I turned into the Avenue Road, and presently was strolling between green fields towards Finchley. The moon was up, but nicely shaded by a thin coating of clouds which extended across the sky. It was an ideal night for it. It was also my last night in town, and I didn't want to give the beggars their last chance. But they did not even attempt to avail themselves of it. Never once did they follow me. My ears were in too good training to make any mistake. And the reason only dawned on me as I drove back disappointed. They had followed me already to the gunsmith's. Convinced of this, I entertained but little hope of another midnight visitor. Nevertheless, I put my light out early and sat a long time peeping through my blind. But only an inevitable Tom, with back hunched up and tail erect, broke the moonlit profile of the back garden wall, and once more that disreputable music, which nonetheless had saved my life, was the only near sound all night. I felt very reluctant to pack Dean and Adams away in his case next morning, and the case in my portmanteau, where I could not get at it in case my unknown friends took it into their heads to accompany me out of town. In the hope that they would, I kept him loaded and in the same overcoat pocket until late in the afternoon when, being very near my northern destination and having the compartment to myself, I locked the toy away with considerable remorse for the price I had paid for it. All down the line, I had kept an eye for suspicious characters with an eye upon me, but even my self-consciousness failed to discover one, and I reached my haven of peace and of fresh fell air, feeling, I suppose, much like any other fool who has spent his money upon a white elephant. Chapter 9. My convalescent home. The man Braithwaite met me at the station with a spring cart. The very porter seemed to expect me, and my luggage was in the cart before I had given up my ticket. Nor had we started when I first noticed that Braithwaite did not speak when I spoke to him. On the way, however, a more flagrant instance recalled young Rattray's remark that the man was not like other people. I had imagined it to refer to a mental, not a physical, defect, whereas it was clear to me now that my prospective landlord was stone deaf, and I presently discovered him to be dumb as well. Thereafter I studied him with some attention during our drive of 4 or 5 miles. I called to mind the theory that an innate physical deficiency is seldom without its moral counterpart, and I wondered how far this would apply to the deaf mute at my side, who was ill-grown, wizened, and puny into the bargain. The brow-beaten face of him was certainly forbidding, and he thrashed his horse up the hills in a dogged, vindictive, thorough-going way which at length made me jump out and climb one of them on foot. It was the only form of protest that occurred to me. The evening was damp and thick. It melted into night as we drove. I could form no impression of the country, but this seemed desolate enough. I believe we met no living soul on the high road, which we followed for the first 3 miles or more. At length we turned into a narrow lane, with a stiff stone wall on either hand, and this eventually led us past the lights of what appeared to be a large farm. It was really a small hamlet, and now we were nearing our destination. Gates had to be opened, and my poor driver breathed hard from the continual getting down and up. In the end, a long and heavy cart track brought us to the loneliest light that I have ever seen. It shone on the side of a hill, in the heart of an open wilderness, as solitary as a beacon light at sea. It was the light of the cottage which was to be my temporary home. A very tall, gaunt woman stood in the doorway against the inner glow. She advanced with a loose, long stride, and invited me to enter in a voice harsh, I took it, from disuse. I was warming myself before the kitchen fire when she came in carrying my heaviest box as though it had nothing in it. I ran to take it from her, for the box was full of books, but she shook her head and was on the stairs with it before I could intercept her. I conceive that very few men are attracted by abnormal strength in a woman. We cannot help it. And yet it was not her strength which first repelled me in Mrs. Braithwaite. It was a combination of attributes. She had a poll of very dirty and untidy red hair. Her eyes were set close together. She had the jowl of the traditional prize fighter. But far more disagreeable than any single feature was the woman's expression, or rather the expression which I caught her assuming naturally, and banishing with an effort for my benefit. To me she was strenuously civil in her uncouth way. But I saw her give her husband one look, as he staggered in with my comparatively light portmanteau, which she instantly snatched out of his feeble arms. I saw this look again before the evening was out, and it was such a one as Braithwaite himself had fixed upon his horse as he flogged it up the hills. I began to wonder how the young squire had found it in his conscience to recommend such a pair. I wondered less when the woman finally ushered me upstairs to my rooms. These were small and rugged, but eminently snug and clean. In each a good fire blazed cheerfully. My portmanteau was already unstrapped, the table in the sitting room already laid, and I could not help looking twice at the silver and the glass. So bright was their condition, so good their quality. Mrs. Braithwaite watched me from the door. "I doubt you'll be thinking them's our own," said she. "I wish they were. Squire sent 'em in this afternoon. For my use? I doubt he thought what we had ourselves wasn't good enough. And it's him 'at sent tea armchair, tea bed linen, tea bath, and that they're looking glass and all. She had followed me into the bedroom, where I looked with redoubled interest at each object as she mentioned it, and it was in the glass, a mask-lined shaving glass, that I caught my second glimpse of my landlady's evil expression, leveled this time at myself. I instantly turned round and told her that I thought it very kind of Mr. Rattray, but that, for my part, I was not a luxurious man, and that I felt rather sorry the matter had not been left entirely in her hands. She retired seemingly mollified, and she took my sympathy with her, though I was none the less pleased and cheered by my new friend's zeal for my comfort. There were even flowers on my table, without a doubt from Kirby Hall. And in another matter the squire had not misled me. The woman was an excellent plain cook. I expected ham and eggs. Sure enough, this was my dish, but done to a turn. The eggs were new and all unbroken. The ham so lean and yet so tender that I would not have exchanged my humble, hearty meal for the best dinner served that night in London. It made a new man of me after my long journey and my cold, damp drive. I was for chatting with Mrs. Braithwaite when she came up to clear away. I thought she might be glad to talk after the life she must lead with her afflicted husband, but it seemed to have had the opposite effect on her. All I elicited was an ambiguous statement as to the distance between the cottage and the hall. It was not so far. And so she left me to my pipe and to my best night yet, in the stillest spot I have ever slept in on dry land. One heard nothing but the bubble of a beck, and it seemed very, very far away. A fine, bright morning showed me my new surroundings in their true colors. Even in the sunshine, these were not very gay. But gaiety was the last thing I wanted. Peace and quiet were my whole desire, and both were here, set in scenery at once lovely to the eye and bracing to the soul. From the cottage doorstep one looked upon a perfect panorama of healthy, open English country. Purple hills hemmed in a broad, green, undulating plateau, scored across and across by the stone walls of the north, and all dappled with the shadows of rolling leaden clouds with silver fringes. Miles away, a church spire stuck like a spike out of the hollow, and the smoke of a village dimmed the trees behind. No nearer habitation could I see. I have mentioned a hamlet which we passed in the spring cart. It lay hidden behind some hillocks to the left. My landlady told me it was better than half a mile away, and nothing when you get there. No shop, no post office, not even a public house. I inquired in which direction lay the hall. She pointed to the nearest trees, a small forest of stunted oaks, which shut in the view to the right, after quarter of a mile of a bare and rugged valley. Through this valley twisted the beck which I had heard faintly in the night. It ran through the oak plantation and so to the sea, some 2 or 3 miles further on, said my landlady, but nobody would have thought it was so near. Squire was to be away today, observed the woman, with the broad vowel sound which I shall not attempt to reproduce in print. He was going to Lancaster, I believe. So, I understood, said I. I didn't think of troubling him, if that's what you mean. I'm going to take his advice and fish the beck. And I proceeded to do so after a hearty early dinner. The keen, chill air was doing me good already. The perfect quiet was finding its way into my soul. I blessed my specialist. I blessed Squire Rattray. I blessed the very villains who had brought us within each other's ken. And nowhere was my thanksgiving more fervent than in the deep cleft threaded by the beck. For here the shrewd yet gentle wind passed completely overhead, and the silence was purged of oppression by the ceaseless symphony of clear water running over clean stones. But it was no day for fishing and no place for the fly, though I went through the form of throwing one for several hours. Here the stream merely rinsed its bed. There it stood so still, in pools of liquid amber, that when the sun shone, the very pebbles showed their shadows in the deepest places. Of course I caught nothing, but towards the close of the gold-brown afternoon, I made yet another new acquaintance, in the person of a little old clergyman who attacked me pleasantly from the rear. "Bad day for fishing, sir," croaked the cheery voice which first informed me of his presence. Ah, I knew it must be a stranger, he cried as I turned, and he hopped down to my side with the activity of a much younger man. "Yes," I said, "I only came down from London yesterday. I find the spot so delightful that I haven't bothered much about the sport. Still, I've had about enough of it now, and I prepare to take my rod to pieces." "Spot and sport," laughed the old gentleman. "Didn't mean it for a pun, I hope? Never could endure puns. So you came down yesterday, young gentleman, did you? And where may you be staying? I described the position of my cottage without the slightest hesitation, for this parson did not scare me. Except in appearance, he had so little in common with his type, as I knew it. He had, however, about the shrewdest pair of eyes that I have ever seen, and my answer only served to intensify their open scrutiny. "How on earth did you come to hear of a godforsaken place like this?" said he, making use, I thought, of a somewhat stronger expression than quite became his cloth. "Squire Rattray told me of it," said I. "Huh, so you're a friend of his, are you?" And his eyes went through and through me like knitting needles through a ball of wool. "I could hardly call myself that," said I, "but Mr. Rattray has been very kind to me." "Me him in town?" I said I had, but I said it with some coolness, for his tone had dropped into the confidential, and I disliked it as much as this string of questions from a stranger. "Long ago, sir?" he pursued. "No, sir, not long ago," I retorted. "May I ask your name?" said he. "You may ask what you like," I cried, with a final reversal of all my first impressions of this impertinent old fellow. "But I'm hanged if I tell it you. I am here for rest and quiet, sir. I don't ask you your name. I can't for the life of me see what right you have to ask me mine, or to question me at all, for that matter." He favored me with a brief glance of extraordinary suspicion. It faded away in mere surprise, and, next instant, my elderly and reverend friend was causing me some compunction by coloring like a boy. "You may think my curiosity mere impertinence, sir," said he. "You would think otherwise if you knew as much as I do of Squire Rattray's friends, and how little you resemble the generality of them. You might even feel some sympathy for one of the neighboring clergy, to whom this godless young man has been for years as a thorn in their side." He spoke so gravely, and what he said was so easy to believe, that I could not but apologize for my hasty words. "Don't name it, sir," said the clergyman. "You had a perfect right to resent my questions, and I enjoy meeting young men of spirit, but not when it's an evil spirit, such as I fear possesses your friend. I do assure you, sir, that the best thing I have heard of him for years is the very little that you have told me. As a rule, to hear of him at all in this part of the world is to wish that we had not heard. I see him coming, however, and shall detain you no longer, for I don't deny that there is no love lost between us." I looked round, and there was Rattray on the top of the bank, a long way to the left, coming towards me with a waving hat. An extraordinary ejaculation brought me to the right about next instant. The old clergyman had slipped on a stone in midstream, and as he dragged a dripping leg up the opposite bank, he had sworn an oath worthy of the godless young man who had put him to flight, and on whose demerits he had descanted with so much eloquence and indignation. Chapter 10. Wine and Weakness. "Sporting old parson who knows how to swear," laughed Rattray. "Never saw him in my life before. Wondered who the deuce he was." "Really," said I, "he professed to know something of you." "Against me, you mean?" "My dear Cole, don't trouble to perjure yourself. I don't mind, believe me. They're easily shocked, these country clergy, and no doubt I'm a bugbear to him. Yet I could have sworn I'd never seen this one before. Let's have another look." We were walking away together. We turned on the top of the bank, and there the old clergyman was planted on the moor side, and watching us intently from under his hollowed hands. "Well, I'm hanged," exclaimed Rattray, as the hands fell and their owner beat a hasty retreat. My companion said no more. Indeed, for some minutes we pursued our way in silence, and I thought that it was with an effort that he broke into sudden inquiries concerning my journey and my comfort at the cottage. This gave me an opportunity of thanking him for his little attentions. "It was awfully good of you," said I, taking his arm as though I had known him all my life. Nor do I think there was another living man with whom I would have linked arms at that time. "Good," cried he. "Nonsense, my dear sir. I'm only afraid you find it devilish rough. But at all events, you're coming to dine with me tonight." "Am I?" I asked, smiling. "Rather," said he. "My time here is short enough. I don't lose sight of you again between this and midnight." "It's most awfully good of you," said I again. "Wait till you see. You'll find it rough enough at my place. All my retainers are out for the day at a local show. Then I certainly shall not give you the trouble." He interrupted me with his jovial laugh. "My good fellow," he cried, "that's the fun of it. How do you suppose I've been spending the day? Told you I was going to Lancaster, did I? Well, I've been cooking our dinner instead. Laying the table, getting up the wines. Never had such a joke. Give you my word, I almost forgot I was in the wilderness. So you're quite alone? Are you? Yes. As much so as that other beggar who was monarch of all he surveyed. His right there was none to dispute, from the watted down to the glade. I'll come, said I, as we reached the cottage. Only first you must let me make myself decent. You're decent enough. My boots are wet, my hands. All serene. I'll give you 5 minutes. And I left him outside, flourishing a handsome watch, while on my way upstairs, I paused to tell Mrs. Braithwaite that I was dining at the hall. She was busy cooking, and I felt prepared for her unpleasant expression, but she showed no annoyance at my news. I formed the impression that it was no news to her. And next minute I heard a whispering below. It was unmistakable in that silent cottage, where not a word had reached me yet, save in conversation to which I was myself a party. I looked out of window. Rattray I could no longer see, and I confess that I felt both puzzled and annoyed until we walked away together, when it was his arm which was immediately thrust through mine. A good soul, Jane, said he, though she made an idiotic marriage, and leads a life which might spoil the temper of an archangel. She was my nurse when I was a youngster, Cole, and we never meet without a yarn, which seemed natural enough. Still I failed to perceive why they need yarn and whispers. Kirby Hall proved startlingly near at hand. We descended the bare valley to the right. We crossed the beck upon a plank. We're in the oak plantation about a minute, and there was the hall upon the farther side. And a queer old place it seemed, half farm, half feudal castle. Fowl strutting at large about the back premises, which we were compelled to skirt, and then a front door of ponderous oak, deep set between walls fully 6 feet thick, and studded all over with wooden pegs. The facade, indeed, was wholly grim, with a castellated tower at one end, and a number of narrow, sunken windows looking askance on the wreck and ruin of a once prim, old-fashioned, high-walled garden. I thought that Rattray might have shown more respect for the house of his ancestors. It put me in mind of a neglected grave, and yet I could forgive a bright young fellow for never coming near so desolate a domain. We dined delightfully in a large and lofty hall, formerly used, said Rattray, as a courtroom. The old judgment seat stood back against the wall, and our table was the one at which the justices had been wont to sit. Then the chamber had been low-ceiled. Now it ran to the roof, and we ate our dinner beneath a square of fading autumn sky, with I wondered how many ghosts looking down on us from the oaken gallery. I was interested, impressed, awed not a little, and yet all in a way which afforded my mind the most welcome distraction from itself and from the past. To Rattray, on the other hand, it was rather sadly plain that the place was both a burden and a bore. In fact, he vowed it was the dampest and the dullest old ruin under the sun, and that he would sell it tomorrow if he could find a lunatic to buy. His want of sentiment struck me as his one deplorable trait. Yet even this displayed his characteristic merit of frankness. Nor was it at all unpleasant to hear his merry, boyish laughter ringing round hall and gallery, ere it died away against a dozen closed doors. And there were other elements of good cheer. A log fire blazing heartily in the old dog grate, casting a glow over the stone flags, a reassuring flicker into the darkest corner, cold vines of the very best, and the finest old Madeira that has ever passed my lips. Now, all my life I have been a moderate drinker in the most literal sense of that slightly elastic term. But at the sad time of which I am trying to write, I was almost an abstainer from the fear, the temptation, of seeking oblivion in strong waters. To give way, then, was to go on giving way. I realized the danger, and I took stern measures. Not stern enough, however, for what I did not realize was my weak and nervous state, in which a glass would have the same effect on me as 3 or 4 upon a healthy man. Heaven knows how much or how little I took that evening. I can swear it was the smaller half of either bottle, and the second we never finished, but the amount matters nothing. Even me it did not make grossly tipsy, but it warmed my blood, it cheered my heart, it excited my brain, and it loosened my tongue. It set me talking with a freedom of which I should have been incapable in my normal moments, on a subject whereof I had never before spoken of my own free will. And yet the will to speak to my present companion was no novelty. I had felt it at our first meeting in the private hotel. His tact, his sympathy, his handsome face, his personal charm, his frank friendliness had one and all tempted me to bore this complete stranger with unsolicited confidences for which an inquisitive relative might have angled in vain. And the temptation was the stronger, because I knew in my heart that I should not bore the young squire at all, that he was anxious enough to hear my story from my own lips, but too good a gentleman intentionally to betray such anxiety. Vanity was also in the impulse. A vulgar newspaper prominence had been my final and very genuine tribulation, but to please and to interest one so pleasing and so interesting to me was another and a subtler thing. And then there was his sympathy, shall I add his admiration, for my reward. I do not pretend that I argued thus deliberately in my heated and excited brain. I merely hold that all these small reasons and motives were there, fused and exaggerated by the liquor which was there as well. Nor can I say positively that Rattray put no leading questions, only that I remember none which had that sound, and that once started, I am afraid I needed only too little encouragement to run on and on. Well, I was set going before we got up from the table. I continued in an armchair that my host dragged from a little book-lined room adjoining the hall. I finished on my legs, my back to the fire, my hands beating wildly together. I had told my dear Rattray of my own accord more than living man had extracted from me yet. He interrupted me very little, never once until I came to the murderous attack by Santos on the drunken steward. "The brute!" cried Rattray. "The cowardly, cruel, foreign devil. And you never let out one word of that." "What was the good?" said I. "They're all gone now, all gone to their account. Every man of us was a brute at the last. There was nothing to be gained by telling the public that." He let me go on until I came to another point which I had hitherto kept to myself. The condition of the dead mate's fingers, the cries that the sight of them had recalled. "That Portuguese villain again!" cried my companion, fairly leaping from the chair which I had left and he had taken. "It was the work of the same Cain that killed the steward. Don't tell me an Englishman would have done it. And yet you said nothing about that either." It was my first glimpse of this side of my young host's character. Nor did I admire him the less in his spirited indignation, because much of this was clearly against myself. His eyes flashed. His face was white. I suddenly found myself the cooler man of the two. "My dear fellow, do consider," said I, "what possible end could have been served by my stating what I couldn't prove against a man who could never be brought to book in this world. Santos was punished as he deserved. His punishment was death, and there's an end on't." "You might be right," said Rattray, "but it makes my blood boil to hear such a story. Forgive me if I have spoken strongly." And he paced his hall for a little in an agitation which made me like him better and better. "The cold-blooded villain," he kept muttering. "The infernal, foreign, bloodthirsty rascal. Perhaps you were right. It couldn't have done any good, I know, but I only wish he'd lived for us to hang him, Cole. Why, a beast like that is capable of anything. I wonder if you've told me the worst even now." And he stood before me, with candid suspicion in his fine, frank eyes. "What makes you say that?" said I, rather nettled. "I shan't tell you if it's going to rile you, old fellow," was his reply. And with it reappeared the charming youth whom I found it impossible to resist. "Heaven knows you have had enough to worry you," he added in his kindly, sympathetic voice. "So much," said I, "that you cannot add to it, my dear Rattray. Now then, why do you think there was something worse? You hinted as much in town. Rightly or wrongly, I gathered there was something you would never speak about to living man." I turned from him with a groan. "Ah, but that had nothing to do with Santos." "Are you sure?" he cried. "No," I murmured. "It had something to do with him, in a sense, but don't ask me any more." And I leaned my forehead on the high oak mantelpiece and groaned again. His hand was upon my shoulder. "Do tell me," he urged. I was silent. He pressed me further. In my fancy, both hand and voice shook with his sympathy. "He had a stepdaughter," said I at last. "Yes? Yes. I loved her. That was all." His hand dropped from my shoulder. I remained standing, stooping, thinking only of her whom I had lost forever. The silence was intense. I could hear the wind sighing in the oaks without, the logs burning softly away at my feet, and so we stood until the voice of Rattray recalled me from the deck of the Lady German and my lost love sighed. So that was all. I turned and met a face I could not read. Was it not enough? Cried I. What more would you have? I expected some more foul play. Ah! I exclaimed bitterly. So that was all that interested you? No, there was no more foul play that I know of. And if there was, I don't care. Nothing matters to me but one thing. Now that you know what that is, I hope you're satisfied. It was no way to speak to one's host. Yet I felt that he had pressed me unduly. I hated myself for my final confidence, and his want of sympathy made me hate him too. In my weakness, however, I was the natural prey of violent extremes. His hand flew out to me. He was about to speak. A moment more, and I had doubtless forgiven him. But another sound came instead and made the pair of us start and stare. It was the soft shutting of some upstairs door. I thought we had the house to ourselves, cried I, my miserable nerves on edge in an instant. So did I, he answered, very pale. My servants must have come back. By the Lord Harry, they shall hear of this. He sprang to a door. I heard his feet clattering up some stone stairs, and in a trice he was running along the gallery overhead. In another I heard him railing behind some upper door that he had flung open and banged behind him. Then his voice dropped and finally died away. I was left some minutes in the oppressively silent hall, shaken, startled, ashamed of my garrulity, aching to get away. When he returned, it was by another of the many closed doors, and he found me awaiting him, hat in hand. He was wearing his happiest look until he saw my hat. Not going, he cried. My dear Cole, I can't apologize sufficiently for my abrupt desertion of you, much less for the cause. It was my man just come in from the show and gone up the back way. I accused him of listening to our conversation. Of course he denies it, but it really doesn't matter, as I'm sorry to say he's much too fresh, as they call it down here, to remember anything tomorrow morning. I'll let him have it, I can tell you. Varlet, caitiff, but if you bolt off on the head of it, I shall go back and sack him into the bargain. I assured him I had my own reasons for wishing to retire early. He could have no conception of my weakness, my low and nervous condition of body and mind. Much as I had enjoyed myself, he must really let me go. Another glass of wine, then? Just one more? No, I had drunk too much already. I was in no state to stand it, and I held out my hand with decision. Instead of taking it, he looked at me very hard. The place doesn't suit you, said he. I see it doesn't, and I'm devilish sorry. Take my advice and try something milder. Now do, tomorrow, for I should never forgive myself if it made you worse instead of better. And the air is too strong for lots of people. I was neither too ill nor too vexed to laugh outright in his face. It's not the air, said I. It's that splendid old Madeira of yours. That was too strong for me, if you like. No, Rattray, you don't get rid of me so cheaply much as you seem to want to. I was only thinking of you, he rejoined, with a touch of pique that convinced me of his sincerity. Of course I want you to stop, though I shan't be here many days. But I feel responsible for you, Cole, and that's the fact. Think you can find your way? He continued, accompanying me to the gate, a postern in the high garden wall. Hadn't you better have a lantern? No, it was unnecessary. I could see splendidly, had the bump of locality and as many more lies as would come to my tongue. I was indeed burning to be gone. A moment later I feared that I had shown this too plainly, for his final handshake was hearty enough to send me away something ashamed of my precipitancy, and with a further sense of having shown him small gratitude for his kindly anxiety on my behalf. I would behave differently tomorrow. Meanwhile, I had new regrets. At first it was comparatively easy to see, for the lights of the house shone faintly among the nearer oaks. But the moon was hidden behind heavy clouds, and I soon found myself at a loss in a terribly dark zone of timber. Already I had left the path. I felt in my pocket for matches. I had none. My head was now clear enough, only deservedly heavy. I was still quarreling with myself for my indiscretions and my incivilities, one and all the result of his wine and my weakness. And this new predicament, another and yet more vulgar result, was the final mortification. I swore aloud. I simply could not see a foot in front of my face. Once I proved it by running my head hard against a branch. I was hopelessly and ridiculously lost within 100 yards of the hull. Some minutes I floundered, ashamed to go back, unable to proceed for the trees and the darkness. I heard the beck running over its stones. I could still see an occasional glimmer from the windows I had left. But the light was now on this side, now on that. The running water chuckled in one ear after the other. There was nothing for it but to return in all humility for the lantern which I had been so foolish as to refuse. And as I resigned myself to this imperative though inglorious course, my heart warmed once more to the jovial young squire. He would laugh, but not unkindly, at my grotesque dilemma. At the thought of his laughter I began to smile myself. If he gave me another chance, I would smoke that cigar with him before starting home afresh, and remove from my own mind no less than from his all ill impressions. After all, it was not his fault that I had taken too much of his wine, but a far worse offense was to be sulky in one's cups. I would show him that I was myself again in all respects. I have admitted that I was temporarily, at all events, a creature of extreme moods. It was in this one that I retraced my steps towards the lights, and at length let myself into the garden by the postern at which I had shaken Rattray's hand not 10 minutes before. Taking heart of grace, I stepped up jauntily to the porch. The weeds muffled my steps. I myself had never thought of doing so, when all at once I halted in a vague terror. Through the deep lattice windows I had seen into the lighted hall, and Rattray was once more seated at his table, a little company of men around him. I crept nearer, and my heart stopped. Was I delirious, or raving mad with wine? Or had the sea given up its dead?